Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining today's Onward session on understanding free speech rights. My name is Catherine Skolnicki, and I'm the residency manager at City of Asylum in Pittsburgh, and also a member of the Onwards working group. For those of you who may not be familiar, Onwards, which is the Opportunity Network for at-risk writers, artists, rights defenders, and scholars, is a collaborative initiative of different U.S. civil society groups, and we come together to assist people who are in fellowships, sponsorships, residencies, and short-term arrangements here in the U.S. To help find stability once those temporary placements are over. And so we've created this online resource that includes live workshops and sessions to support all of the different aspects of coming out of a residency program and being able to continue your career successfully here in the United States. Today, we're very grateful to be joined by Vic Walczak. Vic is the legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Pennsylvania, and he has litigated civil rights cases for nearly 40 years, the past 34 years with the ACLU of PA. And he oversees the organization's litigation statewide. Today, he will discuss First Amendment rights in today's political climate, and he'll provide insight into the law and the current reality, including lessons learned from recent and ongoing court cases. Just to give a little overview of the structure, Vic will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we will open for discussion and question and answer. We are recording the session, but if you are not comfortable with being on screen and you have a question, you can always write it in the chat, and then we will read the question aloud without identifying your name. And I think we are good to begin. So thank you so much, Vic, for being here. If you have throughout the session, if you have any questions or concerns, you can always message me or Jonathan directly as well. All right. Thank you, Vic.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks, Jonathan. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you. Nice to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to come meet with you all. I hope I can say something that's going to be helpful to you, and or at the very least, I can entertain you for an hour and a half. But we'll see how it goes. I'm going to talk a little bit about my career work, some personal history, a little law, and then that current events thing that's kind of creating issues for everybody. And then we'll be happy to take questions about anything that I discuss or that I haven't discussed that's of interest to you. As Catherine mentioned, I've been a civil rights lawyer for almost 40 years, 39 years now. I started out 5 years doing prisoners' rights for Legal Aid Bureau in Maryland, and the last 34 years I've been at the ACLU of Pennsylvania. For folks who don't know about the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, we are the oldest civil liberties NGO in the United States. We're not quite as old as the NAACP, with whom we work very often, but we've been around since 1920. We have handled more cases in the U.S. Supreme Court than anybody but the U.S. Department of Justice, which represents the federal government. You really will not find an area of civil rights or civil liberties that the ACLU has not helped craft, for better or worse. I like to think we're usually on the side of trying to make it better, but unfortunately we don't win all of our cases. And the ACLU essentially covers a broad range of issues, all of the rights, almost all of the rights and liberties that are found in the Constitution. So the political freedoms in the First Amendment, the privacy freedoms in the Fourth Amendment, due process in the Fifth, Sixth, 14th Amendment. So, our portfolio is very broad, but from the very beginning of our founding, one of our first clients was Eugene Debs, the labor organizer who was accused of being a communist and actually jailed. We've had a passion for the First Amendment, and I certainly have in my career. I've litigated cases across the spectrum, but there's a special place in my heart for the First Amendment, and that amendment is particularly important to us today. Um, in the First Amendment just covers all different types of expression. So that, the cases I've done, I've defended every imaginable brand of protester, whether it's the NAACP or the Ku Klux Klan or the Nazis or employees unions. We've represented police and correctional officers who are trying to criticize their bosses, teachers, get out the vote people, door-to-door canvassers, librarians, book readers, homeowners, public transit and sponsors, potty mouth students, and student activists. And in all the time that, in all of these cases, I have never, ever had to worry about whether or not a particular individual enjoys the rights that we're advocating for under the First Amendment, right? It doesn't, it's I've always said, as quoting Voltaire, who said, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the right to say it. And that's been kind of our motto. And I've also never worried about the identity of the individual because this is the United States, it's the Constitution, and at least for the past 50 or so years, 60 years maybe, we've been moving towards making sure that those constitutional rights apply to anybody and everybody who happens to be in the United States, regardless of their immigration status. Now, that's not completely true, and I'll come back to where there are some gaps in that. But by and large, it's not an issue that I have ever had to worry about as a litigator here in the United States. But let me say that I have long understood that we are particularly privileged in the United States to have these rights, to have the rule of law, to have a court system dedicated to the rule of law, where NGOs like the ACLU can go in and defend anybody and everybody's rights, regardless of what they're saying, especially when they're speaking about political matters. But I'm going to give you a little bit of my personal background. So I am an immigrant. My parents were Polish. They escaped from post-World War II communist Poland. Managed to get into Sweden, where I was born, and then came to the United States when I was 3 years old. I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen from an early age. So I understand what it's like to live in a place where you're different, right? And even though I'm a US citizen, I grew up, my first language was Polish. We had different cultures. My parents spoke funny. I remember inviting, my parents, when I was, I think, 4 or 5, said, do you want to have a birthday party? I'm like, yeah, that'd be great. So they invite my, some of my classmates over, and they say, what kind of cake do you want? And I said, oh, I want my favorite cake, which is a flourless walnut ground cake with coffee frosting. And I scarfed this down. I remember them putting it on the table and half the kids like looking at it and the other half taking one bite and saying, oh my God. And I'm like, God, we really are different. So, I feel like a big part of maybe why I do this work is having grown up with some sensitivity to, we're somewhat different. But in our view, the beauty of the United States is that shouldn't matter, and it certainly shouldn't matter in the eyes of the law. And I have subscribed to that from day one and have litigated on that premise. But before I went to law school was the early 1980s. Folks may remember the Solidarność trade movement in Poland. Lech Wałęsa. And it was kind of the beginning of the unraveling of the communist regime and autocracy in Poland. And just because I spoke Polish where I was going to university, after martial law was declared in Poland to crack down on solidarity, I worked with refugees who came to this country. And then right before going to law school, I went to Poland and stayed with Solidarność leaders in Gdansk. And I had never been to Poland, even though I'm a Polish background. And I heard lots of stories about what it was like in martial law and what it was like before that. But it took less than an hour for me to appreciate what autocracy means. And I had heard all about stories that times are tough, food and almost everything is rationed. People were getting coupons. There was lots of scarcity. And I got to the folks that I was staying with from the trade union, and they said, "Do you want to go for a walk?" I said, "Sure." And we come upon a large storefront window that looks like your fanciest deli in New York. There are beautiful hunks of meat and fruit and chocolate and vegetables. And I'm like, I thought you didn't have any of this here. And my host says, "Well, we do, but that's only for the party people. Like us regular people can't get that." Right. And you don't know me, but you may figure out in the course of the time we spend together, I wear my feelings on my sleeve and I start like, what the F? How can they do that? And next thing I know, his hand, this is in the middle of Gdansk on the street, his hand comes smack across my mouth and he's looking around and I see real fear in his eyes. And he says, "You can't say that out in public. You don't know who's listening. We could get in trouble." In my entire stay in Poland, I had countless examples of people expressing that fear, especially in criticizing the government, especially in talking about politics. And it just, impressed upon me how fortunate we have always been in the United States that we don't have to worry about what we say. We have the First Amendment. And fortunately for me, for most of my career, that has been true. And I've represented anybody and everybody, including, the worst of the worst. I've represented the Ku Klux Klan. And as I regularly would say to them at the start of any representation, I say, "Look, I'm going to represent you. I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to protect your free speech rights, but we're not going to talk about politics because the only thing we have in common is that we both use sheets, except I sleep on mine and you wear yours." Right. And so we've never had a problem, but they too, if it's a right, then everybody has to enjoy that right. I remember back about 30 years ago representing the Klan in a case. Part of the law we were challenging said nobody who's wearing a mask can engage in a political demonstration. And we're in front of a very conservative Republican appointed judge who's now on the circuit, has become a friend. And the lawyer for the Klan says, "Judge, in Bedford County, we don't abide cowards. People can't hide behind masks if they want to speak. They need to come out." And I remember the judge leaning with his glasses down over his eyes and says, "Mr. Stroop, cowards too have constitutional rights." And that has really been kind of the watchword for the work that I've done, is that this applies to everybody. But let's look at the reality. So it's nice to say that the Constitution, especially the First Amendment, applies to everybody, but historically that has not always been so. The First Amendment, right? And some of us think that it's the First Amendment for a reason because it is preeminently important: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to petition, assemble, press, all those really vital kind of political freedoms are in the First Amendment. And it simply says Congress shall make no law respecting blah, blah, blah. Right. It doesn't say there's exceptions for here. Congress can distinguish here. It just says Congress shall make no law. It is written in absolute terms. But we know very well that from the very beginning, those rights did not apply to everybody. In fact, they really only applied to white males and even only white males who owned property, right? So from the very beginning, that haughty language, the right word, highfalutin language really has not been seen in reality. But over the course of a couple of 100 years, I think we have moved in the right direction. Importantly, at the country's founding, neither women nor enslaved Black Americans had any rights, much less free speech rights. And it really wasn't until the Civil War and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that we had more sort of written law there to justify applying the rights to everybody. And I just want to importantly point out, because people say, well, how do you know that Congress intended to include everybody and not just citizens in the Constitution? And if you look at the 14th Amendment, which has a number of clauses, but importantly, there's one that provides for due process, provides for equal protection, and essentially is used to say that all of the rights in the first 10 Bill of Rights apply to the states. It talks about no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. So Congress knows the word citizens back in 1866 when this is passed. And then it says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So within this single clause, Congress separately uses citizens in one clause, privileges and immunities clause, but for due process and equal protection, it uses persons. And this is deliberate. And I think anybody who says, no, this only applies to citizens, to me, that's proof positive that that was what Congress actually intended. Even after the Civil War, of course, we know that our Constitution was imperfect. Jim Crow laws essentially disenfranchised Black Americans until the 1960s. We had communist scares essentially between World War I and World War II, and then we dealt with McCarthyism. After 9/11, there was some curtailment of rights, and what we've really seen is the courts coming down and distinguishing arriving aliens. So if you're not a citizen, you're outside the border of the United States and you're coming to this country, the courts say, well, okay, government's got more latitude to decide who comes in. People who are already here, even non-citizens, have far more rights than people who are trying to get in. But even there, for instance, after 9/11, the USA Patriot Act did create some loopholes, giving Congress the authority to deport people, who are found to support, associate with, fund what they might call terrorist organizations. So again, we're starting to see cracks in, or a resumption of cracks in treating citizens differently than non-citizens for purposes of the Fourth Amendment. But nonetheless, this year, until this year, I have never really worried about representing anybody and having to, especially in a First Amendment case, and having to inquire about somebody's immigration status. Now, if you came to me with a question about whether or not you should attend a demonstration, right? If you are a person that has no status, let's say you arrived without any kind of status or you overstayed, but you're out of status, I would say you have that right, but you're putting yourself on the radar if they find you and you don't have your papers, you're not in status, you may be increasing your risk of detention. But if, for instance, you're a green card holder, lawful permanent resident, or you're here on a B1, B2, J1 visa, and you've not, committed any kind of crimes which could change your status, I would say you have absolutely nothing to fear by going to a demonstration, regardless of what it is, regardless of what views are being promoted or what you may be associating yourself with. Now that unfortunately has changed. So one of the big free speech cases that I'm working on now is on behalf of a group called Students for Justice in Palestine. We have a lawsuit against the University of Pittsburgh. They have tried to shut down the organization. Well, they have actually or suspended the organization right now, and that's what we're fighting in court. But when we got into that case, I had to ask whether any of the leadership of the group were non-citizens. It made me sick to my stomach to even have to ask that. But I felt that it's important to do that because in the course of trying to help people, we don't want to unwittingly increase their risk, right? And given what we're seeing from the current presidential administration, they are erratic, they are unpredictable, they are flaunting the law, they are pushing vague and ambiguous laws in ways that both make no sense and are unprecedented. But when you see people like Mahmoud Khalil or Ms. Ostork, or a handful of others that literally were snatched in broad daylight off a street by masked individuals. I mean, and I will say every single one of those cases, the courts have now ruled in favor of those individuals. Unfortunately, some of them were made to spend months in jail for that. But the reality is that we don't know what this administration is going to do. And so I had to talk to my Students for Justice in Palestine clients. Nobody in leadership is somebody who is a non-citizen, so it was not an issue. But for me, the fact that after doing this work for nearly 40 years, it is the first time I had to ask that question was really chilling. And I still remember sitting in the room with 8 students and just feeling sick about having to ask that question. But that is the world in which we live in. I'm a civil rights lawyer, a human rights lawyer. I believe in the First Amendment. I don't ever want to advise people that they have constitutional rights, that they have a particular constitutional right, but say maybe you shouldn't exercise that, right? Because if you have a right, you got to use it. If you don't use it, you're going to lose it, right? But we got to be cautious. We don't ever want to make somebody's situation worse than necessary. And I think, my job as a lawyer is not to tell people what I wish the law were. And in fact, the law hasn't really changed. It's just how it's being enforced, how it's being applied. But given that we don't know, that that I view my job as saying, okay, here's what we believe the rights are. Here's what the law says currently. Let's look at your risk factors. And for instance, it's going to vary for everybody. If you're an academic and you're at Harvard or Columbia or Penn, and you're going to speak out, especially if you're going to speak out on a disfavored topic like what's going on in Gaza, like your risk for something bad happening is going to be greater than if you're probably at another university or another institution. So every situation is going to be, very fact specific. So people should, if you're coming upon some critical decision that you have to make, or you find yourself in a situation where you're not quite sure, it's best to get legal advice about that specific incident. But nobody wants to spend time in jail. Nobody should be spending time in jail for what they say. But unfortunately, we've seen over the last 6 months that that has happened all too often. Now, I think chances are minimal, especially with, we saw a wave of these abductions in March and April, saw legal challenges involved in most of those cases. We've seen the courts reject the government's justification for that. We haven't seen any new pickups in the last 3 or 4, maybe 3 months, right? But again, nobody can say that it's not going to happen again. So I think that the best that we can do is to tell people that here's where the law is. We think the law is very strong, very protective. Uh, we don't know what the federal government might do. They are unpredictable. And here's kind of the political reality. If you're in Nebraska somewhere, then it may not matter. If you're in New York City and at Columbia, then the calculus may be a little bit different. Um, I'm going to stop there because I think that you all probably have questions. I could talk about a lot of things, but what I really want to do is be helpful to you all and to answer questions or go into the areas that you're interested in. So happy for you all to lead me. And just as Catherine cautioned, if you don't want to be associated with a question, just put it in the chat. That's not going to be shown on the recording is my understanding. So I will stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Vic. We do have, I also have a few questions of my own, and I have a few questions that came through a direct message. So I'll ask, well, first we have in the chat, someone had asked a question that I believe you've spoken to, but just sort of about this is a new precedent, essentially, 2025. We've seen, um, you know, um, oppression of free speech in a way, and just a more fear in the atmosphere. So I believe you already answered that question, but if there's anything else that you want to speak to about it being sort of like setting a new precedent. Um,
Yeah, so I think many of the good decisions are in the context of the administration detaining people for, pro-Palestinian, pro-Gaza related speech, folks like Mahmoud Khalil and Ms. Osturk. Um, um, it's helpful precedent. We don't think it's new. We think that what the administration has done in those cases and in many others, whether it's the CVIS student revocations or the use of the Alien Enemies Act, which we have one of the cases here in Pennsylvania. There's not much support for what the administration is doing. But people are being hurt. Even if we're winning these cases, some of these people have spent months in jail. Some of our clients were sitting in a notorious prison in El Salvador for several months. They're now in Venezuela. So, regardless of what we think the law is, what we know the law is, what the courts think the law is, doesn't mean that people, might not get hurt. And the real wild card is, what is the U.S. Supreme Court going to do? And with a very small number of exceptions, the Supreme Court has been greenlighting the administration's actions. Now I think, to be fair, in most of those cases, they are interim decisions. They are, looking at preliminary injunctions, and so it's not a final decision. It can and should come up in a more rigorous and thorough review, what's called on the merits review. But on a speed dating kind of process, the court has frustratingly not put up any roadblock to what the administration is doing in a lot of these cases. One real exception being that, saying that, if you're going to send somebody to El Salvador, that they should have some due process. But again, we're not even sure how strong that is, given what's happened with their efforts to send people to other third countries, including South Sudan, where you'd have a hard time traveling to on your own.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I also received a question if someone who is in the US as an asylum seeker, and say they have an asylum case pending and they are a journalist and they have publicly criticized the current administration, what kind of risks might, would there be risks to their asylum case if they have published criticisms of the US government?
There should not be, under the law, a risk simply for criticizing the US government. We don't know what this administration is going to do. We have a client right now, a young man out of New York, perfectly clear record, presented at the border, came in through the CBP-1 app, was paroled into the country, has applied for asylum, has passed his credible fear interview, and yet he's sitting in detention here in Pennsylvania. We have a judge appointed by President Trump during his first term who saw nothing wrong with that, and so we continue to fight that. So again, I just, as I said to Catherine, and when we were talking about doing this, it is a really, really uncomfortable situation for me, because I shouldn't have to worry about whether or not the government is going to flaunt the law. But the world we're living in is that we see that happening on an almost daily basis, which makes it very hard to give people advice, and it makes it very hard to be truly confident that rule of law is going to stand up. And that is the danger in losing the rule of law, right? Something that I haven't had to really worry about in this country. In 2013 or 14, I went to Russia to do training on strategic litigation for human rights lawyers there. And I remember thinking that I'd probably learn more and gain more from them than they did for me. But one of the things that really struck me was that so many of the things that we relied on here to advance our interests through the rule of law were not available in the Soviet Union at the time, and certainly not now. Things have gotten worse there. Things like a free and independent press, things like courts being bound by factual records, things like some integrity in the rule of law. And I'm like, wow, that really sucks. I can't wait to get back to the United States. And unfortunately, those are all things that we see creeping in the United States. I mean, it's been hard for me. This is the only country I've ever really known. And what's so painful is I think for so many people that we've taken it for granted that that this is our birthright. I wasn't born here, right? These rights, this rule of law, um, a judiciary that follows that rule of law. And we're seeing that it really isn't, that it could vanish. Now, I still have hope that we will survive and that the rule of law will prevail. But I don't know. I think the jury's still out. We're going to have to see how it goes. So sorry, I just, if you can't tell, I'm really uncomfortable on all these questions because I don't know that I can provide really strong assurance given the uncertainty, the unpredictability, the erraticness of this administration and
Mhm.
the cruelty, frankly.
Yeah, thank you. That's definitely heard and understood. Um, a little bit of extension of the question that I just asked. I believe that many people are concerned about what they share in general online. So even we know now that the US administration is looking at social media accounts, and especially for those who have pending cases with immigration court. And I know you said there's a lot that you can't predict, but um, and also you feel like you're in a bind, and I think we all do because we all work towards freedom of expression in some capacity to give advice to tell people to maybe restrict what they say online feels like a contradiction. But if people are most concerned about their security, which is something that I have come across again and again in the past several months, people have told me I'm okay with restricting what I say online. I just want to be safe as possible. Um, would you be able to speak to that at all? Or if there's anything in particular you feel like people who are okay with self-censoring for the moment, um, topics to avoid?
Yeah, look, if your overriding concern is security, and by that I mean the government not coming after you in some fashion, then staying away from controversial speech, especially speech critical of the government, is going to be in your best interests. And, even in saying that, that it brings me back to my experience in martial law Poland, right? Or what people experience in authoritarian countries all around the world, right? What the hell's going on in this country when you got to worry about, can I say this or not say this? Should I be afraid? Right? The fact that we're even having that discussion shows how far we've fallen in this country in just what, 7 months, seven short months. But look, if you want to stay out of trouble, don't say anything controversial. Now, as I said earlier, as a human rights lawyer, we not only want to defend people exercising their rights, but we also want to promote and encourage people to exercise their rights. Right. At the end of the day, we're not going to get out of the situation we're in now because the courts are going to save us. We're going to get out of this because the people are going to seize control. People are going to say enough is enough. And I don't think it's going to be around immigration. I think it's going to be when people realize that they've been sold a bill of goods, and they're not getting their health care and they're not getting their social security checks, and real sort of kitchen table issues are impacting people. And so, people are going to need to exercise their rights and speak out and criticize and demonstrate, and write op-eds and post on social media. But if you are not a citizen, it's pretty clear that the administration at least does not believe that you have the same rights as a citizen. And they have acted on that, and they may act on that again. So, I think we kind of, I guess, keep hearing the term ethical lawyering, right? We're not, I don't make any money from doing these cases. We're here to help people, and what we don't want to do is make people's predicament worse. Just because we think they should be exercising their rights, you have to make up your own mind about how to conduct yourself in any given situation.
Yeah, thank you. There was a kind of a suggestion in the chat around if you could provide any examples of the types of speech that have been flagged in recent, months or in this past year and used against non-citizens. So of course you alluded to the fact of just criticizing the government, but anything else in particular
Well,
worth noting?
certainly Israel and what's going on in Gaza seems to be a third rail, and that's true not just for non-citizens, but obviously we have a lawsuit against the University of Pittsburgh because of their repression of students for justice in Palestine. What we've seen at Columbia and Penn and Harvard, and this predates the current administration. I mean, the congressional hearings, I think, were late last summer, last fall, before this administration started. Looking at whether the universities were, quote, anti-Semitic. I am the child of a Holocaust survivor. But I will say that that the definition of anti-Semitism is indefensible. That they are using criticism of Israel as not anti-Semitism. You can't equate the two. But certainly, there are plenty of examples where people talking about that are being targeted, including foreigners. In the most high profile case, like Mahmoud Khalil, maybe the most prominent example. Other areas where we're starting to see that revolve around immigration. A good bit of that is people trying to help undocumented folks who are getting rounded up. We just had a raid outside of Pittsburgh last week, and they ended up arresting and detaining two observers who were simply yelling criticisms at the police and videotaping, what they were doing. So, um, I mean, this is an administration that is pushing the envelope on all of its anti-immigrant activities, and they're not taking criticism very well. So I think that's a fraud area. Um, yeah, I'm not sure there's other sort of just whole categories of speech. Um, that this administration has really gone after the trans community in a really, in my view, despicable and a particularly cruel way. But we have not yet seen action against people who are standing up for trans rights. There's not that many people who are doing that. So, yeah, that it's kind of hard. It's hard to say what other areas they're going to be particularly sensitive to besides the ones I've mentioned.
Thank you. Um, I have a specific question around when people are have traveled outside of the US and they're returning, and they are going through customs at ports of entry, and they get, I've been reading recently in the news of even, it was a naturalized US citizen who was pulled into questioning and was questioned for 5 hours straight. And this was a principal at a or a superintendent of a school district, and they were demanding that he open his computer and share files of students' information with him, and he refused. And they told him that he did not have any rights at a port of entry. Um, and I'm just curious, from a legal perspective, is that true? What what would you recommend that people do in situations if they are being questioned by any kind of authority and they are told that they don't have rights? Yeah.
I don't think that's right. You said this person was a citizen. I mean,
A
citizens,
naturalized citizen.
yeah, I mean, there should be no difference. And we know this administration is trying to exploit that difference between, born here and naturalized. Um, the police or even coming back, I mean, they have, I think the government has a bit more authority, but you do not have to answer questions. I just came back from a trip abroad and spent a lot of time with our tech folks just because, obviously we've got about 60 lawsuits against the Trump administration already. So there's a lot of information on my various technology platforms that could be very useful to the government. And talking about, disengaging from drives and things like that. But ultimately what it came down to is they said, make sure you disengage your biometric information that allows you to automatically open and turn your devices off and make sure you've got, some kind of password protect on there. And they say, and certainly on the iPhones, but I think also on the Android, that you're pretty protected, because even if they turn it on, unless you give them the password, they're not going to be able to get into the device. So I do think being cautious. I mean, I just flew again last week domestically, and I went and got a printed boarding pass rather than use my phone, and turned off my phone as I was going through security. Now, it's what they're going to do if you are an LPR or you're here on a visa. Same answer as before. You should be protected. You shouldn't have to answer. You shouldn't have to turn over that information. But we don't know what the administration's going to do. They keep coming up with new and creative ways of reading the law. And so yeah, unpredictable.
Yeah. Thank you. I can see Tatiana, you have your hand raised.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for this topic, important topic, and for your explanation. And you mentioned possible pressure from the administration. But what about pressure from collective authority and self-censorship? For example, I had personally had situation where when my student stated that the library is an institute that was invented by white men, and that is why black women couldn't expect, any progress and liberation in the case of using libraries. And I had discussion about this, of course, and later, I was given advice from my colleagues, be more careful with such kind of discussions, and not justify kind of imperialistic achievements. And later, I received feedback from my students about my course. And one of these evaluation was extremely negative, 1 from 20. But this result is lowered my average, of course. And later, I had similar situation with my article when it was rejected from publication because of my position. So a situation arises in which you supposedly have freedom of speech, but in reality, you don't have the ability to speak. And I wonder if you could recommend any non-legal tools, perhaps some societies or associations, maybe media, that could be helpful in this support for silenced voices to be heard. Thank you.
Yeah, so I I think that what you're describing is not something that's unique to non-citizens. I think it's a problem that we've seen in our society writ
Definitely.
large, yeah, for a long time, and I think especially in academia, for a long time, the folks on the right have been claiming that they're being censored, and now that they're in ascendancy, they double down on their ability to censor themselves. So, the hypocrisy is a bit is a bit amazing out there. I'm not the person to ask about, how to get those messages, how to get those voices out. Um, and legally I think there are few tools to address the problem that you mentioned, right? I think it's a combination of a lack of tolerance for different views, um, and just the lack of any kind of grace, and appreciation for the importance of free speech and promoting broad views. I mean, I think society as a whole is really going to have to change. That's not something that we're going to change with the law, right? It's people are going to have to come back around to that. With the situation you describe is very hard, and I'm not sure there's anything you could have done to assuage that one student who was upset. If you're intent on being upset, you're going to be upset, and if you're going to write a bad review to try to hurt you, then you're going to go ahead and do that. And there's not a whole lot you can do that. Hopefully, you've got superiors who understand the dynamics and how. Right? I mean, you work in a restaurant or anywhere, you may have a disgruntled person who's going to try to create problems for you. So I'm sorry. I don't know. Maybe, Catherine and Jonathan have ideas about platforms, to get messages out beyond, your own.
I would say nothing is coming to mind right away, but Tatiana, if you want to send us an email so we have your contact information and, maybe we can be in touch that way and follow up with you. That would be great.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
very
you
much.
can share it in the chat you can direct message if that's okay. Yeah. Yeah, this is a really complex topic, so thank you, Vic, for struggling along with us. We feel your struggle as well. Does anyone else have any other questions for Vic?
I will say that we're ready for a fight. So if you, hopefully not, or somebody or come across gets into one of these situations where it just feels like, oh my God, this looks like a classic fact pattern for a law school exam about how many ways can you violate the Constitution. We are not afraid. Right? We are not afraid to take on tough cases. We are not afraid to take on controversial cases. I would say that if you have personal situations where you think your rights are at issue, we would be happy to do, a confidential intake and provide confidential advice, and if appropriate, representation in court, in bringing a legal challenge. I mean, we are not one of the folks who's worried about the repercussions of fighting back. I mean, the Attorney General Pam Bondi has, been on social media saying ACLU is a lawyer for, terrorist groups like Tren de Aragua. So, we've been doing this for a long time. We're not going to stop doing it now. Our job is to challenge the government. So all I will say is that if you have a dicey situation, feel free to reach out. Obviously I only cover Pennsylvania, but know and work with the folks in our national office, know folks in most of the other states. So, if you're outside of Pennsylvania, you could reach out to me and, we'll be happy to connect you with my counterparts in whatever state applies.
We have a question about the Fourth Amendment. And the question is, as immigrants or asylum seekers, are we covered by the protections provided by the Fourth Amendment regarding the right to counsel in case of an encounter with ICE?
So the Fourth Amendment does not include the right to counsel. That's in the Sixth, and then by extension, the 14th amendments. You have a right to, so in any encounter with police or ICE, you can, and if you're out of status, should exercise your right to be silent. They need to have some credible evidence to be able to detain you. And most often that evidence simply is provided by the individual because they're intimidated or bullied into providing information that, they are here from another country and have no status. The Fourth Amendment rights do apply to any encounters that you have with police. So they have to have some individualized suspicion. If you're in a car, you have to turn over certain vehicle related documents, but you don't have to answer questions about your status, and unless they have independent evidence of your status, they can't act on that. So, there's a lot more there. There are, I think, as Jonathan posted, there are, our resources on ACLU's website. There's a number of other NGOs that have excellent resources online. We generally call those Know Your Rights, KYR, documents. And there's lots of good information online about your rights with encounters, with law enforcement, including with ICE agents. So, I will say that one question I've gotten from people who are non-citizens is whether they should, and they have some kind of status, whether they should be carrying, evidence of their status with them. I think it's probably prudent to do so. Again, it's one of those areas where I don't think you should have to do that. But it's if you clearly have status, being able to produce that if necessary at a moment's notice can be helpful, and may keep you out of trouble. Catherine, do you want me to talk about the
Sure, I'll
Jonathan's
read the question aloud. There's a question: do you expect cases that are currently being litigated to clarify the limits of restrictions on free speech? Are there key cases working their way through the courts?
I do think that we will see clarification, but ultimately, as I said earlier, everything is going to depend on the U.S. Supreme Court. The lower courts, I think, have been doing a very good job. Obviously not perfect, but a very good job at pushing back at, what we view as the administration's lawlessness. But ultimately, it's going to depend on what the court does, the Supreme Court. And this is not a court that is particularly hospitable to civil liberties, to expanding most rights, except maybe religious liberty rights for, a small, very particular religions. Yes, Jonathan, I do think that we will get clarification. I don't know how long it's going to take. Um, as you know, cases have to work their way up through several levels, whether they come through the state court system or the federal court system. We may have inconsistent decisions from those courts. And at some point, they get to Supreme Court. That may not be for a while. So I think we will be in this kind of in a time where the law is unclear. I mean, it could be a while. We could be talking about years.
Does anyone have another question for Vic? I do have a sort of general question that is a little philosophical, but if there were any court cases that might provide, I don't know, some type of grounding for the question. So just it regards kind of the responsibility of the government around free speech and misinformation and disinformation that we've seen very much lately. And if there's any sort of accountability that is built into our laws around that, I think a lot of people are obviously concerned.
Yeah, so I don't believe there really are a lot of safeguards. So whether you're talking about, health related information or misinformation that's being put out there, we've seen social media platforms, have their own free speech rights and can and should impose their own guardrails and protections, but we've seen those systematically dismantled over the last few years. So in terms of holding the government accountable for mis and disinformation, there is not a lot of law to do that, right? Which is a little bit scary, and I think I've been worried for quite some time about what happens, when you get rid of the independence that you have in some of the government agencies like the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And as we saw last week, when you get, when they put out information, which by every account is credible, by a highly respected, and the government doesn't like that result, and they say, we're going to fire that person, and you put your own people in there. Are we going to be able to trust the information that comes out the next time? And obviously that does damage to everybody because people rely on that information. And if it's not accurate, then, there could be consequences down the road. But, I don't see short of challenging the dismissal of that individual, I don't see that a way to hold the government accountable for that. And unfortunately, while the lower courts have held that that the executive's dismissal of, for instance, leaders in independent agencies violates the law, the Supreme Court has overturned those and allowed the administration to go forward. It relates to a Supreme Court case from the 1930s about whether or not, you can have executive agencies that operate independently of the executive, which they should. There's good reason for all those things. But I think there's indications that the Supreme Court will be re-examining that and may well throw that out. Again, giving the executive even more power than they have now. So, obviously those are all rule of law concerns, but yeah, not a lot of hope in the law for holding the government accountable for mis and disinformation. That's a problem.
Thank you. Well, Jonathan has been sharing in the chat links, as Vic mentioned earlier, to a lot of resources on the ACLU website. So please feel free to, click on those links, and then we will be sure that they are on our website as a resource as well on onwardsproject.org. And Vic, do you have any, if no one has questions, perhaps you have some closing words or a bit of encouragement, if possible, at this time?
So I, I'm an optimist. I'm a glass half full kind of guy, and I mean, there's no denying that what we're seeing in this country is extremely painful. And for the first time in my life, it feels like being a constitutional lawyer or a human rights lawyer. And usually having more more information and understanding is a helpful thing. In this case, I think it's creating stress because I think we can see the real peril that is facing this country and facing the rule of law. But I just remember, when we first came to this country, and the generosity and the affection and the support. We lived in places, we moved to Tennessee when we first came here, and then lived in Oklahoma, and then, ultimately moved to wherever we went. I mean, I do believe in the basic decency of the American people. Now that's tested these days when you see some of the, awful comments and awful actions that are going on out there. But at the end of the day, I do not believe. I mean, I think the American people will draw a line, and I do think people will rise up. And as Howard Zinn, the historian, often said, we don't know what's going to happen. There's always surprises. There's always the unexpected. So I continue to have hope that even though we're going through dark times, I suspect they're going to get darker before they get lighter. But I think at the end of the day, the rule of law will prevail in the United States, and we will get through this difficult time. But ultimately, at the end of the day, people are going to have to stand up, and we talk about knowing your rights and exercising your rights, and especially your free speech rights and the right to political advocacy and public expression. That is going to play a very, very big role in how well the United States gets through this difficult time. So, but I continue to have hope, and I hope you will too.
Thank you so much. We certainly do. That's why we are in this work. That's why we do what we do.